Hello, this is Rabble Radio, recorded on Friday, May 2nd, 2025. I'm Brianne Doyle. Rabble.ca shares with you the news of the day through a progressive lens. If you're curious about what's happening in Canadian politics, labor, the environment, and beyond, you've come to the right place. This is news for the rest of us. Thanks for tuning in. On April 26, a violent attack took place at the Lapu Lapu Day Festival in Vancouver, an event meant to honor Filipino heritage and community. At least 11 people were killed and many others injured. In the days since, members of the Filipino community in Canada and their allies have been coming together to grieve, reflect, and support one another during this difficult time. This week on Rabble Radio, labor reporter Gabriela Calugay-Casuga spoke with Zuha Zubair from Migrante Ottawa to reflect on the recent Lapu Lapu Day tragedy in Vancouver and to shed light on the often overlooked struggles faced by Filipino migrants in Canada. Here are Gabriela and Zuha in conversation. Take a listen.
Hello to our Rabble Radio listeners. My name is Gabriela Calugay-Casuga, and I am the labor reporter here at Rabble. Today, I'm interviewing Zuha Zubair from Migrante Ottawa, and for some of the people who might know my journalism history, I actually got my start as a reporter and radio host for Migrante Ottawa's radio show. While it's unorthodox usually for journalists to interview people with which they have some sort of connection, given the recent Vancouver attack at the Lapu Lapu Day Festival, Rabble has decided that it would be worthwhile to have an episode this week that is focusing on platforming Filipino community voices for the Filipino community. So thank you so much for joining us today, Zuha.
Thank you so much for having me, Gabriela.
Just before we get into it, I wanted to check in. How have you been doing with the recent events and news?
I'm doing all right. I think we had a vigil yesterday for the victims and their families, and we had a prayer, and that really helped. It was very emotional, and I think a lot of us have been feeling really shocked and I don't know how you're supposed to process something like this, especially alone. So I think the numbness from before is definitely come down now, and I feel a lot better now.
I'm glad to hear that you're feeling a bit better, and I can definitely relate to you on that piece of feeling shocked and almost numb. When I had first heard it, I couldn't even fully process what had happened to our community, and it really does feel like a direct attack on our community, our Filipino community in Canada, because the event was very much about, or it was about Filipino heritage and was about our history. You mentioned the vigil that happened recently. Can you tell me a bit more about what it meant for you to be having that vigil in response to this tragedy?
hmm We organized the vigil as soon as we could because we knew that people needed to come together and we needed to process what was happening collectively. And you're absolutely right. It felt like a direct attack on our community. Lapu Lapu Day is so meaningful, and it's a festival with children, with families. So it's so horrific that that is the context in which we had to get together. But yeah, like I said before, it was through the community that we're able to collectively feel and collectively process the grief and the mourning. And we're already so alienated here in Canada as migrants, as diaspora. So there's already pain in our heritage in being here. And so it's heartbreaking that our people, when we've come together to express our heritage, to have something festive, something tragic happened.
Yeah, I totally get what you mean. And I like what you mentioned there about kind of the meaningfulness of Lapu Lapu Day. I mean, obviously, I know about the meaning behind Lapu Lapu Day as a Filipino, but maybe just for our listeners, would you be able to kind of explain who Lapu Lapu was and what our people, what our community in Vancouver was celebrating?
Mhm. Lapu Lapu was the leader of the first revolution that Filipinos led against colonizers. And so Lapu Lapu Day is really a celebration of Filipino resistance, Filipino strength, and yeah, Filipino revolution and and defending our land.
Yeah, yeah, and I like what you mentioned there too. Like, it is really like a representation of our long history of revolution. We have, there were hundreds of revolts against the Spanish, local revolts against the Spanish when they had colonized us, and then the Katipunan had defeated the Spanish in the 1890s. And then we even see it to this day with things like the People Power movement that ousted Marcos Sr., for example. So I think for me, I definitely had a lot of feelings seeing an attack happen on a day that was supposed to represent our resilience in a moment to commemorate how we fight against foreign domination and violence. And I was wondering what was kind of going through your head when you had first heard about the news. What kind of thoughts were you having?
hmm I I think definitely there was a lot of anger and just a lot of upsetness for our community. And yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the long-standing history of like Filipino revolutions because yeah, wherever Filipinos are, they're unfortunately it's through all of these like streams of exploitation, but Filipinos are really strong and always coming collectively to fight for their rights. And I think in that moment, I was just thinking about how the Filipino community here in Canada has been through so much. Like we've come here through all these streams of colonialism and imperialism, and what you had said, it's foreign domination of our land and the conditions in the Philippines that have caused people to look outwards for survival. And they've come to Canada expecting better lives, expecting safety, expecting to be able to look after their families. So for Filipinos, even here to not be safe was horrifying. And yeah, it's definitely painful because we're not in the best circumstance in Canada either. Migrants in Canada are struggling anyway without these tragic events happening. We're struggling to feed our families. We're struggling to pay rent. We're struggling to access healthcare. And so it's painful.
Yeah, and I definitely relate to what you're saying there about the migrants here in Canada sometimes often struggling because we were forced out of our home due to the conditions in the Philippines. I'm curious, could you elaborate a bit more for our listeners? Just kind of what is it that, our people are facing back home and also here when they're searching for livelihood and, a better life?
hmm Yeah, the Philippines is technically an independent country, but unsurprisingly, the people that actually control all the resources are the elites in the Philippines, and it's unfortunately the US foreign-owned companies that are there mining resources that are pushing people out of their land, out of their farms. There's a lot of malnutrition, starvation. People are struggling to find jobs. The economy just continues to worsen each year, and the Marcos regime right now, which is like basically a worsening and continuation of the Marcos Senior regime, just continues to depend on foreign investors that come in and take all the resources out of the economy, and our government pockets the money while our people suffer and try to and are forced to leave out. leave the Philippines and come to places like Canada where they believe they're getting better opportunities. But that's not the case because we don't have adequate social services in Canada because states like Canada and the US, they're more invested in funding wars and funding imperialism rather than looking out for the actual people here.
And so I know for myself, like in engaging with my community, I've seen a lot of like sadness, feelings of isolation, and things like that. I'm curious for you as well as a community organizer, what kind of impacts has this system of essentially like exporting workers, how has it, affected the living conditions of Filipinos when they come here? What is it that our people are living like?
um, yeah, I think it's safe to say it's still in dire conditions of poverty. And one thing that's very unfortunate is that the, well, a lot of employers here and the immigration policies here are unfortunately targeting the desperation of Filipino migrants and other migrants as well, but they're targeting the desperation of people coming here to work, and they know that they'll work for anything under any condition. So a lot of Filipinos find themselves in closed work permits or even coming in through fraudulent like agencies and end up being scammed, not realizing that they've essentially been labor trafficked into Canada and they're working on farms, long hours, um, housing that's shared with like a bunch of other workers as well, and they're often not even getting paid their current wages. And yeah, they're the living conditions are really poor, and yeah, our community is really, really struggling here.
Can you elaborate on what you mean by the phrase labor trafficked? What does that look like for people who
Mhm.
experience it?
So labor trafficking is a phenomenon where workers in their home countries or in the Philippines are brought into Canada under an employer who does all of their paperwork for them, but it is usually either like not the actual papers, not the actual visas, and they come in through these channels, find themselves without status in Canada, and instead tied economically to their employer, tied legally to their employer. They have no money because you've paid fees. You're in debt when you come in. You're bonded. It's bonded slavery basically to your employer, and you're forced to work because you have to earn your way to actually go back home, even if that's the case, or you're forced to earn remittances because your family is dependent on you working. But essentially, you're in Canada working tied to your employer under slave-like conditions, and yeah, you've essentially been like it's a fraudulent practice that's brought you here.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that really contextualizes, at least for me, like some of what I've seen from like, our my kababayans around me, especially those who are working and are in situations that just don't seem fair to them as workers. Uh, I'm wondering too, I mean, obviously, not every single Filipino is being labor trafficked in Canada. We are a diverse community here, there's a million of us. But yeah, for a lot of like working class, newly landed migrants, it's a common experience. And so I'm also wondering, just in the context of, the recent tragedy, how does like the pain of this kind of endemic exploitation like interact with the pain of this most recent
Mhm.
violent attack?
I think it's, yeah, I think our community feels it. I think our community recognizes, even if we're not related directly, just knowing that it's our fellow kababayans and knowing the struggle to even get here, the struggle to make it like to the next day here. I think there we feel the pain. We feel the pain of the community collectively. There's so much grief and mourning. Yeah, we want to take on the burden of the community and support one another. And that has been that's been my like what I've heard from the people even at the vigil yesterday. Everyone was talking about how it's so important that we come together and support each other. It's so important to be around Filipinos at this time rather than be alone and alienated. And yeah, I think it's part of the wider pain that we recognize in the community. That's exactly why we want to collectively come together and advocate for justice for our community, advocate for support for the families, because things are expensive as is. How can you survive, especially now with medical bills? Like, yeah, we want to come together as a community and even help with calling for the Philippine consulate to maybe organize some sort of medical fees support, cover lost wages, give some sort of any kind of aid that they can give to ensure that the Filipino community in Vancouver are supported and doing okay.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's important. The victims and their families are supported in this time, and I like what you said too about seeing like the Philippine consulates coming in to actually support, our people, our kababayans here, because I mean, when you think about it, especially as migrants who are coming here, maybe as like temporary workers or things like that, like they're really the body that is supposed to be representing us and having our interests at heart. Is there any other you've kind of mentioned some of these like funding, making up for lost wages, for medical fees, as well as calling for justice. What kind of things do you think people need in terms of like short term concrete actions that can be taken?
Hmm. Yeah, I think we want the voices of the victims' families to be uplifted. We want to know the experiences of the Filipinos in Vancouver, and we want a thorough, like concretely, we want a thorough and transparent investigation into what occurred, and we need truth and justice for the families. Like that is, I think, the most immediate thing.
And I kind of want to connect this also back to kind of the bulk of our conversation. We were talking a lot about really the state of things for our people when we come to Canada here and what kind of goes on. We mentioned labor trafficking and exploitation and the isolation that just is so common for our kababayans when they first land here. So we've talked a bit about what the victims and the families deserve in the face of this recent tragedy, but also in the long term to support our community, not just in the face of this recent tragedy, but when trying to process the kind of persisting challenges that our people face. What do you think it is that we need?
Um, yeah, I think the conditions and the struggles faced by Filipinos here and even in the Philippines, like it's not well known here, especially, and I think we're really isolated here. And our kababayans might not even know that they're in exploitative conditions or that they are deserving of more, um, yeah, of more support from the consulate or even the Philippine state. So I think we really need to get together, especially now, and try to build these connections with our community. We need to speak to one another more, share our experiences, and try to understand what it is that the collective strength that we hold. And yeah, as a community organizer, as someone from a mass organization, I can tell you that very it feels very reassuring to have the support of your kababayans because you're not the only one fighting for your rights and you're not fighting for just your rights. We're all collectively wanting to hold the people accountable who are supposed to look after us and our families. And we're not afraid, like we have more courage when we come together. And so I think long term and just to sustainably navigate the world right now, I think it's so important that we come together and, yeah, become involved in our communities and really fight for our communities here in Canada and even in the Philippines.
Yeah, and I really like what you said is when we come together, we're a lot stronger. And I think just, as another Filipino, I am feeling that in this interview right now in the face of these recent tragedies. I'm grateful that we were able to kind of talk and process together, and I hope this opportunity this to talk has also given our listeners a chance to reflect and process as well, and to know that the Filipino community here is large and loving.
Yeah.
Yeah, very loving. So there are opportunities to connect hands with your fellow kababayans and navigate this together. There's also services and supports available for those who have been affected. Victim services can be reached at 1-800-563-0808, and those in crisis can reach out to 1-800-784-2433. Yeah, so I think this was a great chance to really put everything and all the various pieces that we're processing together and lay it all out there and talk about it together. So thank you so much for joining us on Rabble Radio today, Zuha.
Thank you so much for having me on.
That was Zuha Zubair and Rabble labor reporter Gabriela Calugay-Casuga in conversation. Thanks so much for that, Gabby and Zuha. And now, this is our In Case You Missed It segment, where we review the top stories from this week on rabble.ca. For that, I'll turn things over to Rabble editor Nick Seabrook. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Brianne. After 5 short weeks, the 2025 federal election is over, and the result is a minority government for Mark Carney's Liberals. It was a close race at times throughout the night between the Liberals and the Conservatives, with both parties ultimately picking up seats. Much of the vote that the Liberals were able to pick up in this election came from the NDP, which lost 18 of its seats in the House of Commons. With the Liberals being just a few seats shy of a majority, however, the NDP with its 7 remaining MPs still can hold the balance of power in this new minority parliament. The NDP has still lost party status, however, meaning a loss of access to funding for research, staff, and no seats on House of Commons committees. Leader Jagmeet Singh, who has led the party since 2017, stepped down as leader on election night after failing to win re-election in his own riding. Singh was not the only party leader to fail to win his seat. The leader of the opposition, Conservative Party leader Pierre Poilievre, also failed to win re-election in his Carleton riding, losing to Liberal Bruce Fanjoy. Poilievre was a target of the Long Ballot Committee, which placed nearly 100 candidates on the ballot in his riding. The Long Ballot Committee is a group dedicated to electoral reform, and targeted Poilievre as a way to draw attention to the inequities in Canada's first-past-the-post electoral system. Now that the election is over, David Suzuki is arguing that it is time to turn our collective attention back to pressing issues that got pushed to the wayside during the campaign. Suzuki points out in his latest article on rabble.ca that most of the major party leaders during the campaign did not talk about how they would address the climate crisis. Instead, Mark Carney, for example, talked about how his government would build more oil and gas pipelines. The climate crisis is not going away. As Suzuki points out, last year was one of the hottest on record, and oil and gas continues to be used at a rate that will continue to push temperatures even higher. In other national news, Rabble columnist Charlotte Dahlwood discussed the scant mention of women, women's rights, and women's services in the Conservative Party platform. The word women was only mentioned 4 times in the entire document, 3 of those times in their anti-trans women policy. Dahlwood said that while Conservatives talk a big game when it comes to punishing those who commit violent crimes against women, they are completely silent when it comes to actually providing services to women, trans or otherwise. Furthermore, both the Liberals and the Conservatives do little to protect trans women, especially trans women who are experiencing incarceration in Canada's federal prison system. The prison system often fails to recognize trans women entirely, placing incarcerated trans women in the male prison population. Dahlwood calls on all parties to do more to support women, whether they be free or incarcerated, trans or cisgendered. Also this week, Monday marked the National Day of Mourning for workers injured or killed in the workplace. Canada's largest private sector union, Unifor, said that employers often underreport workplace injuries and deaths, which can leave dangerous conditions unaddressed. The Canadian Union of Postal Workers also drew attention to workers who were injured and their families, noting that there were 247,022 accepted claims for lost time due to a work-related injury or disease last year. Many of these injuries or diseases could be with these workers for the rest of their lives, creating hardship not just for them, but those that depend on them as well. In other news, in her latest article, Rabble columnist PK Much chronicles Toronto's Red Rebels. The Red Rebels combine theater performance with civil disobedience. Started by Toronto-based feminist activist Jane Addams in 2019, after first seeing the idea in the UK, the Red Rebels attend protests and perform choreographed dances in their signature flowing red dresses. The most recent event was held on April 26 in Toronto to help mark Earth Day. Since its inception, the Toronto Red Rebels have performed at a dozen climate actions, including 2 Grassy Narrows demonstrations and Royal Bank annual general meeting protests. And finally, in world news, the situation in Kashmir is rapidly deteriorating. Last month, a terrorist group with ties to Pakistan attacked tourists in Indian-controlled Kashmir, a rare mineral-rich region disputed between India and Pakistan, 2 nuclear powers. There have been allegations that the Hindu supremacist government in India has engaged in oppression of the Muslim minority population in Kashmir. Dean Akkardi, assistant professor of history at Connecticut College, explained that the Indian government often used anti-terrorism legislation to arbitrarily detain Muslims in Kashmir and destroy their property. As always, you can find the full version of the stories we talked about today on rabble.ca.
Thanks, Nick. And that's it for Rabble Radio this week. Thank you as always for tuning in. If you like the show, please consider subscribing to Rabble Radio on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you to all the journalists and writers who contributed to this week's content on rabble.ca, and thank you to Carl Narenberg for supplying the music. Lastly, thank you to you for tuning in to Rabble Radio. I'm Brianne Doyle, and I'll talk to you next week.